This is Matt Shomo, and you're listening to UC3P.
On Chicagoland, many of our conversations have touched on the fact that Chicago is a highly segregated city. We explore the idea of the invisible but very real borders that divide neighborhoods and communities and shape the opportunities and experiences of Chicagoans. Today, our conversation focuses on a qualitative research project on the perspectives and lived experiences of young Chicagoans.
The University of Chicago's Gen Forward Survey is a nationally representative survey of over 1,500 young adults ages 18 to 34 conducted bi-monthly. It pays special attention to how race and ethnicity shape how respondents experience and think about the world.
Recently, a report came out of the Gen Forward project that takes a more local approach. Race and Place, Young Adults, and the Future of Chicago explores the varying perspectives of young adults across the city and how their experiences differ based on their race and where they live, which in Chicago are often highly correlated.
We're thrilled to speak with two of the authors of this report on Chicagoland today. Cathy Cohen, the founder and director of Gen Forward Survey and the Black Youth Project, is a professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. Her general field of specialization is American politics, though her research often intersects with African American politics, women in politics, lesbian and gay politics, and social movements.
David J. Knight, who is also joining us, is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science here at the university. Before coming to Chicago, David was a certified public high school teacher in Boston and San Francisco. His current research examines how race, power, and public policy affect the transition to adulthood for young people across a range of inequalities. With that, let's get to it. I'm Kyra Sturgill.
I'm Steve Crano.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
This is Chicagoland. Stay tuned.
Cathy Cohen and David Knight, thank you so much for joining us on Chicagoland. So we're just going to jump right in here. Cathy, we first wanted to ask you about the Gen Forward report, hearing a little bit about how that came about.
Well, first of all, Gen Forward is a big research project, and I say big because I'm tired, right? It covers both a national survey of young people ages 18 to 34 with oversamples of African Americans, Latinx, and Asian American young adults, primarily millennials, but increasingly Gen Zers. We field that survey every other month. And the idea is that we want to get kind of topical information and really kind of measure and detail the attitudes, experiences, preferences of young people, right? The point is to try to insert them and their attitudes into the national discourse. We've been doing that since about 2016, right? You know, producing and securing survey data. David Knight, who's sitting right next to me, and Margaret Brower, probably, 2 years ago? 3 years ago? Yeah.
2 years ago.
Walked into my office and said, Gen Forward survey, fantastic. But, you know, they knew that I've been trying to figure out how to do something in Chicago. And they said, we have an idea. How about we do a qualitative study of young people in Chicago, 18 to 29? The idea was that we would interview, or they would interview, 200 young people across the city, primarily in 5 or 6 neighborhoods. And we wanted to kind of detail, again, the experiences of young people in Chicago, but paying attention in particular, and David will probably say more, about kind of how place, where you live shapes your experiences with the city. We didn't only want to kind of use what we would think of as a deficit model to talk about, the absence of education in certain parts of the city or the absence of jobs, but we also wanted to ask questions that would elicit information about happiness, joy, and safety. So that's the report.
And it's an incredible piece of scholarship. I really enjoyed reading through it, and I'm so glad that this is a product that you're putting out to the world. What struck me reading through it is there doesn't seem to be much of an emphasis on policy recommendations. So I'm wondering, who is the ideal audience? Who do you want this report to get in front of? And what can they get out of it? How is it used as a tool?
Sure, I'll say something and then maybe David jumps in. I mean, we actually went back and forth about kind of should we be drawing policy recommendations out? There be a final page that says, okay, we've just talked about education for 10 pages. Here's, in fact, what young people want us to do. One of the things we decided was that instead of producing policy recommendations, we would work with community-based organizations led by young people who are already kind of thinking about issues of policy. So we have a partnership with Chicago Votes. They, through our financial support, do something called Give a Shit Happy Hour. I mean, they've done it before, but and what's really kind of amazing about what they do is they pull together youth-led organizations from across the city. They focus on one or two subjects in the report every time. We show up and try to lend support. And from that group begins to think about what would be the policy agenda that would advance many of the issues detailed in the report. And I think it really is the right type of partnership. You know, it would be great for academics to say, okay, we've kind of done the research and now here are the policy recommendations. But in this case, we're really kind of listening to people who are doing the work, who are in neighborhoods day in and day out, and who are really thinking about kind of what the policy should be and how to advance a campaign that can move that policy recommendation. So we've been, I think, very happy with that process. But David.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that we were very thoughtful about wanting to center the voices of young people of color in particular. And I think that many policy alternatives and recommendations kind of speak to you from their voices. And so with us proposing some type of recommendation would potentially close that conversation. We really want to keep that conversation really open, and the from what we've done with Chicago Votes has been a really wonderful partnership that's really enabled us to also interact as engaged researchers, as people in the community who care around these issues, wanting to make sure that we build a community across activists, artists, researchers, teachers, and others. And so that's really been the aim of the work, and it's been really productive.
And just to kind of follow up, have you had meetings with folks who are in policymaking positions in the city of Chicago about the outcomes of this study and how they could use it to inform future decision making?
Well, first thing I'd say is let's broaden what we mean by people who are in positions of policy making. So I would say young activists who are kind of pushing an agenda around abolition, right? Saying that we have to rethink what safety looks like and that we can't always or shouldn't always rely on the police. I'd call those individuals, right, who are thinking about policy. They're not the traditional kind of policy makers, but they're thinking about policy, and I'd argue they're kind of policy activists. So definitely having conversations with those folks. You know, we have also presented recently through the City Club of Chicago with lots of people who are kind of engaged in policy at the city level. We have not, in case they're listening, been contacted by the Lightfoot campaign or the Lightfoot transition folks, which is fine with me. But so, are we like advising people who are going to determine policy? Not directly, but I would say that if given the choice between kind of only dealing with policymakers or dealing with young activists, I'll choose young activists every day. And I feel good about those interactions and the ways in which they're picking up and using the data we produce.
So I want to just take a step back to when this idea came about. So David, I understand that you and your colleague, Margaret Brower, you approached Cathy about this idea of creating a report that was solely focused on Chicago. So I'm just curious about, how that idea came about. Was it informed by, coming to Chicago, your research here? What was it that you thought that you could accomplish by kind of turning this focus from, a national survey to something that was really focused on how young people are experiencing the city? Right.
So basically, both Margaret and I have a deep interest and commitment to qualitative research. Margaret's done a lot of really important work before coming to Chicago. And this was 2017, the beginning of 2017. And we just come out of a year where they had said there was this historic spike in violence. We also, know that there had been the closure of 50 schools in 2013. The Kwame McDonald case was ongoing. And the Justice Department had just issued its report. So we were really at a time when the social conditions and sort of the institutional setup in Chicago was clear that it had set up a really racially unjust setting for young people to grow up in, to be successful in. And as committed people and who have some skills, we wanted to use that to speak to this issue, and to, especially because the way that people talk about, for example, unequal education in Chicago, or violence in Chicago, really is a deficit orientation that does not think about what young people have to offer, which is so much with regard to solutions. And so we really wanted to focus that in this work, and so that is definitely what brings us all together, is this focus. And so we brought it to Cathy, who we worked very hard to make sure that we had thought through the plan. And so we had looked at, for example, all 77 community areas, and thinking about which areas would really represent the kind of dynamics, the kind of conditions that generally are at play in Chicago. So, for example, more than 70% of the average sort of white resident in Chicago lives in a neighborhood that is more than 70% white, right? The average African American lives in the area that is 2/3 Black, and so Chicago is very racially segregated, which really impacts education and impacts job opportunities. And so we knew that we wanted to think about areas that represented that, because that's what the average person really does experience. And so we thought about we were going to interview 200 young adults, ages 18 to 29, and we were going to talk with them about all of these issues that are impacting them: education, employment, violence, policing, but also thinking about, as Cathy said, hope, joy, freedom in the city, what that means. And so we identified, and we thought about, we were going to basically interview even numbers of African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinx, and whites. And we identified several particular areas. So Inglewood, for example, Pilsen, Chinatown, Bridgeport area, a conglomeration of the North Side, including Westtown and Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast, and Albany Park, which is one of the most diverse areas of the city. And we basically, what Margaret and I did, alongside a team of other graduate students and undergraduates, we would canvas on the sidewalk and in parks at events, and which was a stretch for me. I mean, I'm from the South, and so I just coming up to somebody and saying, "Would you like to participate in something?" That was a stretch for me, but I gained a skill there, and we were able to recruit 200 young people to sit down with us for an hour to 2 hours to have conversations really about their lives, and they really outlined a really strong vision for equity and justice in the city. Yeah.
So I'd like to hone in on education as a issue area for just a bit. Can you speak to some of your findings in the education portion of the Race and Place report, and why you chose to report out on these metrics? If this was research that you did for this study, or if this was research that you simply chose to include as context?
I can begin, and then Cathy can, of course, correct me.
I won't correct you. I'll say yes. That's right. I'll supplement.
Supplement.
Yes, and
that's right.
Yeah.
The report, as you read, and as people can see, brings together a lot of secondary data, and we really worked with a team to basically scour all publicly available data in the city around all these different domains. And we had done an analysis, looking at what are the distinct patterns, what are young people saying to us in these interviews, and how does that map with, how does that align with what we see in the city? There's lots of this that has been written about education, and so the fact that that Chicago is a large public school district, third largest, and yet one thing that we have to remember is that Chicago is also a very, the public school system is very differentiated. And so, for example, the selective enrollment system is one that is not open to all students. And that came up very strongly in interviews. And that is a real issue, because if you think about public schools being public schools and being accessible to everybody, the idea of a selective enrollment school that gets disproportionate types funding, and we know that also is racially disproportionate. That's a problem. That's not a true public school system.
Yeah. So let me just jump in on that. First of all, we would say thank you to Matt Nelson, who really wrote
Yes.
and researched the education section of the report, who's doing a dissertation on education in Chicago.